Hi, my name's Brendan Malone and you're listening to The Edge of Reason, the podcast which explores important issues but doesn't take all day about it. There is a quote that is often attributed to Martin Luther King Jr. that goes something along the lines of, if we wish to progress as a society, then we need to begin the move from a thing-centered culture to a person-centered culture. And it's a quote that I couldn't help but think of as I watched a replay earlier today of the Insight TV program, a current affairs show that was broadcast on the Australian SBS network this week. The television show, the topic of the show was the question of designer babies. Is it morally acceptable? Is it ethically acceptable to engage in eugenics, basically, where you would select things like they discussed the issue of selecting the sex of a baby, screening for genetic abnormalities, disabilities. They even at the end began to discuss the issue of screening for intelligence and other things. And I have to say, I was astounded, and to be fair, I was probably concerned by what I heard and saw and witnessed on that show. I saw an Australian ethicist who told this program that he believed it was profoundly immoral for governments to make it illegal for parents to practice sex selection, so screening out, obviously, and aborting or selecting embryos that are one gender over another, or presumably you would also allow abortion for people who weren't the preferred gender. He also was quoted as saying that he thought that parents have a moral obligation to create the best child possible. In other words, they have a moral obligation to practice eugenics and weed out those that are considered imperfect, inferior. And that wasn't the only thing that I found startling about the show. There was some parents who were featured who had a disabled boy, and obviously they were doing quite an admirable job, really, under the circumstances of caring and raising for that child. But at the same time as doing that, they're also suing for wrongful birth, basically claiming, and they stated on the show that their child should have never been born. I kind of wondered to myself as I saw that, how the heck does this consistent with the statement they made a couple of moments later about the fact that they did love their son, even though they thought he never should have been born? I guess for me, the show, what it really represented was one of the big problems we've got in our culture today. We've got a culture that is a very thing-orientated culture rather than a person-centered culture. What I saw was a whole lot of people who have turned the idea of children, childbirth, conception, bringing new human life into the world into nothing more than a process of like a commodity. Children have become a commodity. Persons have been commodified by these people. In much the same way that you would select a designer couch or the best car or a designer job, your perfect job, we also now have people who are saying that we should design our children, that we should turn them into commodities that we control, that we dominate, that we produce on a whim for ourselves based on what we want. I think it was really quite telling and very frightening when towards the end of the show they asked the audience who believed it was acceptable to select things like intelligence. And a lot of people said, yeah, they thought it was quite acceptable to screen out people who had lower intelligence, select those who were considered to be of higher intelligence. They began to ask about other things, and the issue of sport, fitness, and other things came up. People said they thought that would be a good thing to screen for. I'm not sure if these people realize it, but this is exactly the mentality that permeated and drove the Third Reich. This is what Adolf Hitler's dream was all about, a supreme Aryan race. Now, obviously there's a bit of a difference here, and these people weren't advocating that you should screen for race. But I guess that does raise a bit of a question. If you're going to say it's okay to screen out and destroy human life because it might have a disability, or based on genetic traits, or based on intelligence, or based on sporting prowess, then what possibly could be wrong in that sort of ethical framework with screening out people based on their race? But at this stage, these people weren't advocating that. That's the one point of difference. But apart from that, they were advocating the same notion as Adolf Hitler's pure Aryan sort of perfect society, where you would breed people who had who were superior to others, who were intellectually superior, they were physically superior, they were ideologically superior, they were genetically superior, they were free from the disabilities and deformities that the Third Reich considered to be inferior and made people less than persons. It's the same mentality, and we're discussing it on a prime time talk show, and the majority of people in the audience seem to be going along with this notion. I guess one of the big things that struck me about the show was the fact that there was this massive confusion between persons and suffering. The idea that somehow if you suffer, you are no longer a person, or your life is no longer as valuable or as worthy or as good as people who don't suffer. But the simple fact is all of us suffer. No one is free from suffering. You cannot escape suffering. Every single one of us, even in small ways, we suffer every day of our lives. It is part of the human condition. And this idea, this notion that somehow we should start looking at certain people who have disabilities or certain types of suffering as being less human than the rest of us really is quite frightening. And as I said, what we've done is we've shifted from a culture that looks at persons and sees them as this profound and important good to a culture now that sees them as little more than a commodity or a function. And we say, what is your function? If you have a function or you can do things for yourself, then we will say you have a good life and you are worthy of living. But if you can't perform the functions that we desire or we consider to be good or to be attaining perfection, then you shouldn't have a life. The huge confusion that was present in this program, what I said, was the confusion between screening for diseases and screening out, weeding out persons. We're not simply talking here about ending a disease. We are talking about ending the lives of human persons who have diseases, disorders, who have traits. We're talking here about gender. We're talking about ending the life of someone simply because they aren't the gender that we want. I would suggest to you that our culture is in real trouble if this is becoming the majority opinion on this matter. We are going back to the Third Reich. That's the point. What we need to do is begin that shift away from a thing-orientated culture to a person-orientated culture where we see every new human being, every child as a gift that we receive into our relationships. A child that is born into this world as a gift, as a profound miracle, as a never-to-be-repeated one of a kind, no matter who they are, no matter what they might experience in this life, no matter what issues they may face, no matter what suffering they might come up against in their life. If we are not prepared to do that, then like I said, we have moved back into a mode of thinking that is not only evil, it is completely outdated, and I would suggest to you, I think most of us had thought we'd moved away from after World War II. But it seems we haven't. In fact, not only have we not moved away from that mode of thinking, that eugenic thought, that idea that some human beings are more superior to others, but we are now enshrining it in legislation. We are practicing it in healthcare. We are endorsing this thing. Like I said, when you've got an ethicist who sits there in an audience and says that parents have a moral obligation to create the best child possible, I would suggest to you that we should be alarmed and concerned by that, because that is not the mentality of a culture of love. That is not the mentality of a culture of human rights, a culture that truly does profess to be humane in its approach to persons and to ethics. This is the approach of a culture that is built on the strong will survive, the weak should not prevail. The idea that the strong will impose themselves upon the weaker members of our culture because there is something wrong with those weaker members of our culture, more vulnerable people in our society, and they don't deserve the same rights and treatments as the rest of us. I don't know about you, but that's not my idea of a humane, loving society, and I don't want to be part of a culture that embraces such evil. That's why I guess when I watched that show last night, the replay of that show, I was so disappointed and I guess so concerned by what I saw played out in front of me. Thanks for listening. I'll see you next time.